Imagine giving everything you had to keep a family from falling apart. Your evenings, your holidays, the tiny kindnesses no one ever thanked you for, and then being told you're in the way. That sentence sits in my chest like a stone some mornings. My name is Margaret. I live in a small house on the edge of Portland, a place with a porch that faces the firs and a bird feeder that the Blue Jays consider their personal ATM. I am in my 50s now. I say that because the years matter in what happened next, not as a number to mourn, but as the angle of light that made everything suddenly visible. People imagine a slow shift, the steady accumulation of favors, the quiet assumption that your labor is part of the house's furniture. They don't always see the small betrayals, the way help becomes entitlement, the way intimacy becomes expectation. I left my husband when Emily was 7. I left because the house stopped being safe. I left because I could not teach my daughter to stay with someone who raised his voice more often than his hand. Those are short sentences for long nights. Those years were kitchen floors scrubbed to a shine, school plays where I clapped loud enough for 2 people, summers of second jobs so bills were paid and the heating stayed on. I braided Emily's hair for picture day. I sat up with her through fevers. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still smell the cheap cinnamon of the birthday cake I made on a teacher's salary, and I remember thinking, she will remember this. She won't forget me. Memory edits itself. There are flashes. The time Emily forgot to invite me to a parent-teacher meeting until an hour before. The night I waited in the car outside her dorm for 3 hours because I couldn't stand to see her cry alone. There are other flashes, small, almost foolish things that stitch a life together. The shawl I carried on the porch in autumn, the way the kettle sang at 7 a.m., the scuff on the dining table where the kids' crayons had bled into the varnish. I learned to be quiet in public because drama always split down the middle when I raised my voice. It was less combustible to keep the peace. The years teach you that invisibility is sometimes safer than being a target. So when the doctor said, "There's a mass, we need to run more tests," my first thought, absurdly, was less about chemotherapy schedules and more about whether Emily would be the kind of daughter who would sit on the kitchen step and hold my hand, or the kind who would judge me for being at last inconvenient. Illness has a way of revealing the measure of people. For me, the first measure was not the tumor, but the silence that followed. The diagnosis itself was a blur of polite tones and paper. I can tell you details: the fluorescent light, the little metal tray of instruments, the nurse refolding a cotton swab as if the motion could turn down my fear. I can tell you how the word malignant landed in my mouth like a foreign syllable. But what lodged in my thoughts was a different question. Will she come? For 3 days I clung to that question. I made coffee I couldn't drink, rearranged the books on the shelf so things looked less chaotic, and wrote a sort of letter to myself that read like a conversation I wanted to have later. If she isn't here when I need her, that will not be the end of me. That line frightened me and steadied me at the same time. When I told Emily, the call started like so many of our calls had in recent years, rushed, cloaked in efficiency. "Mom," she said, "are you sure? Did the doctor—" And then she suggested in the same breath things I had not yet considered: schedules, available nurses, what this would mean for work. Practicality, I have learned, is a kind of love for some people. For others, it's distance disguised as help. Emily's voice carried both. Underneath it was a bitter impatience I have seen before. The impatience of a woman who grew up under tension and learned to keep moving because standing still meant hearing things she didn't want to hear. She had reasons. She also had a history of seeing me as a backdrop to her life rather than an actor in it. If you've ever had to tell your child something that might break them, you know the odd choreography of the moment. An idea rehearsed in the shower, then thrown away in the kitchen, then rescued on the porch as the light goes down. Emily's immediate question, "Do you want me to come?" felt both like a lifeline and a test. I said yes, because at the time, yes felt like hope. She came the next day in a suit she wore to work, sat stiffly on my couch and kept glancing at the clock. She brought a casserole and she folded the corner of the foil like she was sealing a document. Her eyes, when they met mine, were not the soft, wide ones of a daughter who had watched me braid her hair. They were narrowed, appraising. That look stayed with me longer than the diagnosis. I have learned to read people by the space they leave. Some come close and stay. Some stand at the threshold and offer instructions. For decades, I had given my presence in full. PTA meetings, bake sales, late-night drives to the ER for a fever that wouldn't break. I filled forms and fed teenagers and sat through marriage counseling that proved in the end to be a rehearsal for leaving. The ledger of my life was full of entries that rarely balanced in my favor because I didn't think of them as transactions. They were just what mothers did. 3 days after Emily left, a woman named Lisa walked into my house with a thermos and a smile that did not try to fix me. If you've ever been sick, you know there are two kinds of helpers: the ones who insist they can make everything right with efficiency, and the ones who know their limits but still refuse to look away. Lisa was of the latter kind.
She was a nurse who had been assigned through a home health service, a kind person who smelled faintly of lavender and brought wool socks that looked like something out of someone's grandmother's drawer, but in the best possible way. She said, "Hi, Margaret, I'll sit where you like." And she sat on the other end of the couch and watched the blue jay on the feeder while I explained the diagnosis again, because saying it aloud made it less monstrous. Her care was a string of small, coherent gestures. She noticed details I had not realized were missing from my days: a chipped mug I always reached for, a stack of postcards I had meant to send but hadn't. On her second day, she came with a tiny bag of birdseed and refilled the feeder. She came with warm socks, the kind that wrap your ankles like small apologies. She sat on the porch, not talking at first, and listened to me when I told her about standing at Emily's kindergarten window and wondering if I had done enough. She never projected pity. She projected steadiness, which is often more useful. It was not that Lisa solved my problems. She could not. No one could. But she saw me. She learned the pattern of my hands, how they worried the hem of a napkin when I was anxious, how they smoothed the shawl over my knees when the night chilled. When I was too tired to explain the latest test result, she would fold my paper and make a simple note: "Call Dr. Hayes on Monday." She made tea that tasted faintly of bergamot and poured it as if it were medicine. Sometimes after a long appointment, we would sit on the porch and watch the light move through the firs and not speak. Those silences were not empty. They were full of someone bearing witness without asking for repayment. Contrast is a powerful thing. Where Lisa's presence restored a little part of my humanity, Emily's presence often emphasized my utility. "Hire someone," Emily said once over the phone, her voice sharp as a file. "We can't have you trying to manage at home by yourself. It's not safe." The words were superficially reasonable. There was an undertone, though, that rubbed like sand, the notion that acknowledging my need meant sidelining me. When Emily suggested hiring help, she meant to make things orderly. What I heard in the long history of our relationship was the same logic that had at times tried to rearrange me into something smaller. There are moments you can pinpoint as revealing. One afternoon, after a chemo session that dropped me into an exhausted fog, Emily popped into the house with a checkbook and a list of agencies. She moved through the rooms as if inspecting a property. "You should probably have someone come by during the day," she said, tapping her list. "It's better that way." There was no softening when she said it. It was a plan already made. I remember folding my hands in my lap and saying, "I like the way Lisa sits. She doesn't rearrange my spaces." And Emily's mouth tightened like she was swallowing a complaint.
"Mom, you can't take this personally," she replied. "This is logistics." She was right, partly. Much of what Emily offered in the years that followed wore the garb of logistics: bills, schedules, competence. There were times her competence saved me from administrative collapse, but competence can also be a weapon if wielded as the only form of care. When someone reduces your needs to a checkbox, the human being beneath sometimes feels like a form to be filed. That's what I was afraid of: the replacement of tenderness with transaction. I had long stopped expecting gratitude where I had once expected it. Thank you notes dissolved into silence, birthdays became brief phone calls. But then Lisa arrived and offered gestures that were neither transactional nor performative. When the chemo took my appetite, she learned to make broths so that they smelled like home. When my hands trembled too much to hold a pencil, she found the thick-handled pens that made writing possible again. Once, when a grandchild, Anna, who is 7 with a face like a sunburned doll, came over and dropped a crayon drawing of a stick figure family on my table, Lisa pocketed it like treasure. She said to me quietly, "This is what you're keeping. This is the part that matters." That line landed with unexpected force. The children's drawings, the stalled conversations at Thanksgiving, The way the little things I did for years accumulated into the shape of a life, those were my legacy, not a bank account or a list of possessions. I began to feel ownership over those small moments in a new way, a quiet reclaiming that had nothing to do with lawyers or wills and everything to do with my sense of worth. Of course, nothing in a family is tidy. Emily noticed Lisa's ease, and it made her uneasy in ways she often could not articulate. Pride sits in strange places. For Emily, it felt like a wound to watch a stranger receive my confidence when she herself had spent a lifetime doing the same job, sometimes with resentment, sometimes with care. I tried to understand her. She lived a life of tight sequences: work, pick up kids, 2 jobs sometimes, the economy always breathing down her neck. Her impatience with inefficiency was a survival mechanism, but it was also sometimes a shield she used when vulnerable feelings bubbled up. When her father sent a letter on holidays instead of showing up, when he vanished into excuses, Emily learned to be practical and suspicious. That history made her less willing to sit in the messy middle where tenderness lives. There were evenings when things tilted towards something like peace. Emily would come for a visit and bring a casserole and sit across from me with her hands folded, and for an hour or so we would talk about the grandchildren, about work, about the neighbor's new pickup truck. She has her moments of softness. She can still make me laugh at the exact wrong joke, the one that hits the pinched place in a room and briefly releases it.
Those moments are the reason why I refuse to paint her as a villain. She is a daughter with a lifetime of her own scars, some of which were formed in the shadow of my decisions, and some of which she carried independently. There is dignity and shame braided together in her behavior. That complexity is important because it kept me from reducing her to a cartoon in my own story. The trouble began to sharpen when people around the neighborhood started to interpret our family dynamic like a ledger they could balance. Small talk in the barber shop, the woman at the library who had once called to check if I needed soup, chickens at the community garden. Conversations became narratives. "I saw Emily here picking up something for Margaret," someone would say, approvingly, as if a single instance of presence could wipe out 30 years. Other neighbors, quieter, began to ask questions that sounded more like gossip. "Is there someone new helping? Who's paying for that nurse?" Words that are tossed out to fill silence have a way of hardening into judgments. Sometimes the gossip arrived at my door as a kind of sympathy that felt like an accusation. When Lisa's name first began to appear in murmurs, the tone shifted. "Good for you for getting help," people would say, but there was always an undertow, as if who I chose to accept care from was suddenly a moral question for public commentary. It was as if the community were trying to decide whether my needs were a public burden or a private failing. That pressure had consequences. Grandchildren, for example, are porous creatures. They pick up the vibrations in a room and echo them. Anna, who adores me and worships at the shrine of the porch bird feeder, began to ask questions in the small, precise way children ask them. "Grandma, who is Lisa?" she asked one afternoon, crayon clutched in her hand. "She's my friend," I answered. "Is she your nurse?" "Sometimes," I said. "Does she live here?" Anna looked confused, as if the idea of a grown-up living in 2 places at once should require an explanation. Even innocuous curiosity from children has a way of amplifying adult tensions, because kids are mirrors. They reflect what the household is emitting. Emily noticed these small shifts the way someone notices a leak in a ceiling only when the water stains become visible. She began to tighten. Phone calls that were once routine became interrogations. "Who is paying for this?" she asked once, aggrieved. I explained simply. "Lisa is paid by the agency. I asked her to be with me because I felt better when she was around." That explanation did not satisfy. "Are you changing things?" Emily asked. The suspicion coiled into her voice. "We need to talk about the estate," she added, like someone dropping heavy stones into a still pond. This is where the story, which had begun with quiet loneliness and small kindnesses, began to pick up speed and sharp edges. The word estate sounded in my house like a foreign dialect. It pulled at something ancient and human, the fear that love will be quantified in bank accounts and bequests instead of in skin-to-skin moments and bedtime stories. When Emily invoked it, I felt the old ledger open and stare me down. I thought of all the nights I had set an extra plate, all the times I had planted sunflowers in the yard so a child would have a place to run, all the times I had sat through a parent-teacher conference because it mattered. Were those things worth anything beyond the ephemeral warmth of the moment? Could someone mistake decades of care for a simple transaction? I behaved in the beginning, as many people do when a family conversation turns toward money and inheritance. I tried to be reasonable. I told Emily that I wanted her to be involved in decisions, that I valued her input. The truth is that part of me wanted, as we all do, to be held close while I was still alive. Part of me also wanted to protect the small people, the grandchildren, from sudden ruptures that can smash a childhood into odd fragments. The tug-of-war of love and suspicion in that room was palpable. Emily, for her part, felt unheard. She felt, perhaps rightly, that she had been left with the raw end of a family's complications for many years. She had borne financial strain, emotional labor, the burden of a father who left and returned on his own schedule. Those wounds make people defensive, and defense, if left unchecked, can turn into aggression. It was on a gray afternoon in late November that I sat on my porch with a cup of tea and watched Lisa refill the bird feeder while a wind pushed the maples into a small, brave rumple. Emily had been to the house that morning, left in a flurry after a business phone call. I did not see irritation on her face when she left. I saw fatigue, and beneath it, a certain resolute, as if she were deciding to stand guard. 2 hours later she called and asked plainly, "Have you considered putting things in writing?" It was a practical question, but the underside of it was 1,000 judgments about responsibility and worth. An idea I had not fully allowed myself to entertain began to settle in my mind like dust on an old table. Perhaps the time had come to think about legacy not as a ghostly legal concept, but as an articulation of values. Legacy to me had always been the drawings on my refrigerator, the way my grandchildren took my hands and laced their fingers through mine. Still, the suggestion of putting things in writing woke in me a curiosity and a dread in equal measure. Curiosity because clarity can be freeing, dread because once you name a thing, you also make it negotiable. That night I pulled out a small lined notebook I had kept for a decade, the kind with a fabric cover and a ribbon. I began to write not as a plan, but as a conversation with myself. I made odd, tender lists: who had shown up, who had made the house better by their presence, what I would like remembered. The list was a revelation. It read like a ledger of love rather than money. It mentioned birthdays held in borrowed kitchens, the way Lisa had once stayed late when I had a fever and smoothed my forehead. It mentioned the grandchildren's drawings and the stack of cards from neighbors who had brought meals. When I looked at that page, I understood in a new way that legacy is not only what you leave behind, but who you allow to carry you when you cannot carry yourself. That notebook was the start of something, though I cannot have said then what. It made decisions less abstract and more human. It allowed me to imagine a future in which the people who had shown up in my life, the ones whose hands had steadied me, were honored for reasons that had nothing to do with bloodlines. That thought made me feel both guilty and clear. Guilty because to imagine inclusion of someone like Lisa felt, to my daughter, like a diminution of the natural order. Clear because it let me see that I had a choice, to let other people's expectations decide my life, or to choose who would be the keepers of my memory. Emily's reaction to my tentative thoughts was swift and tight. The next time she came over, she sat at the kitchen table with the weight of something rehearsed. "Mom," she said, "you can't just be handing things to strangers. They don't have the same claim." Her voice had the flatness of someone who had played the hurt for so many years that the novelty had worn off. "They did not raise me," she added, in a way that was meant to close the case. I remember the exact way the sunlight fell across the table that afternoon, highlighting the ring near the seam where the varnish had darkened. It seemed obscene to have such a domestic detail witnessed by such an austere conversation. I breathed in, and for the first time said something that startled me by how steady it sounded. "Emily, I am not doing this to spite you. I am doing this because I want the people who cared for me to know they mattered." Her eyes narrowed the way they sometimes did when she felt judged. "I know you want to be fair," she said, "but fair is also about who's responsible. There is a point at which defensiveness ceases to be protection and becomes control. The two can look eerily similar. Emily's idea of responsibility carried with it a set of expectations about how things should be arranged. Mine, increasingly, included dignity for those who showed care in ways that were not counted on any balance sheet. That divergence made the air between us colder, as if a draft had found its way into a house that had forgotten it was winter. I spent the next week in a sort of reflective distance. The chemo drained me physically, but mentally I felt sharper than I had in years. Lisa's presence continued to be a balm. She would arrive with a thermos and sit on the porch and say little, and that silence became a scaffold for things that needed to be rebuilt. We began, almost without noticing, to develop rituals.
On Tuesdays, we would go for a short drive to the little park where the kids flew kites in the spring. On Wednesdays, we would sort through old mail that had accumulated in a basket by the door. On Thursdays, she would bring a bag of words, a small novel, a crossword, something to keep my mind moving. Those small rituals reoriented me toward life rather than toward fear. At the same time, Emily's involvement became more pointed. She started to call more often, not always with warmth. Sometimes there were questions about insurance. Sometimes there were comments about the state of my house. One evening she arrived with 2 of the grandchildren in tow and, after a perfunctory hug, went straight to the point. "Mom, we all love you," she said, as if reciting a script. "But you shouldn't do this alone. It's not a moral failing to ask for help." Anna sat coloring, oblivious, while Emily talked. There was a tenderness in her voice meant for the children. For me, though, it sounded like an ultimatum. That line, "you shouldn't do this alone," is one of the trickiest a parent can hear. It has truth in it, and it has a barb. I have friends who would say Emily was right, and that I should welcome the relief. I agree in principle. Care is not a heroic badge to wear alone. But the particular manner in which Emily offered help cut me, because underneath it was the assumption that my decisions needed correcting. There's a difference between a hand offered and a hand that points. It is here that the story thickens with complication and the slow pressure of decisions. I began to talk to my doctor about what might be possible, to schedule meetings with counselors who could help me navigate both the illness and the family dynamics tied to it. I started to archive things: letters from old friends, the drawings from grandchildren, a note tucked behind a book, small proofs that I had been seen, sometimes by those who never lived in my house but lived in my history. Each page I set aside felt like a candle lit against the dark. Each act of naming felt like an assertion: I will be the author of my life's final chapters. By the time winter settled fully into the pine boughs and the blue jay grew brazen in his appetite, I had made a decision I had not fully anticipated. Not a dramatic decision, but one clear enough to set trajectories into motion. I would speak to a lawyer, not because I wanted to hurt anyone, but because I wanted to be fair to myself. The word lawyer tastes odd on the tongue. It invokes suits and distant offices and a kind of transactional finality. But for me, it was a step toward clarity, a conversation about particulars, not a verdict. I wanted to put things into a form that matched my values, not just leave them to the mercies of gossip and assumption. I called Mr. Holloway on a Tuesday. He had a voice like a grandfather clock, measured, unflappable. He did not give advice. He listened.
I told him I wanted to ensure that the people who had shown up for me in ways that mattered, the grandchildren, the friends who baked, the nurse who sat on my porch and watched the blue jay, were remembered. He asked me a few practical questions and scheduled an appointment. Afterwards, I sat on the porch and held my tea and watched the steam lift and thought about the strange arithmetic of a life, the sum of small acts that had made me who I was. It was around then that the neighborhood chatter began to sharpen into something less benign. A friend from down the street, Mrs. Ortega, stopped by with lemon bars and asked gently if everything was okay. "We want to help," she said. Her help was heartfelt, but at the same time somebody else had begun to wonder in a whisper who would manage the house in the long run. "Isn't it odd," someone said to another neighbor, as if passing a pebble along a stream. "I heard she's been considering changing things." Gossip is a peculiar social animal. It loves to make mysteries into moral judgments. When Emily found out I had spoken to a lawyer, it landed like a coin dropped into a well. There was a brief flurry of voices on the phone, a tone of urgency in her words that hinted at hurt beneath the anger. "Mom, you shouldn't do anything rash," she said, and the word rash was the least of it. In the years of our relationship, rash had been code for wrong in a way I can't tolerate. She was not alone in her reaction. Others began to look at me with a kind of mingled suspicion and curiosity. The days felt colder because decisions that had been private were beginning to be read aloud by everyone else as fodder for debate. I will not pretend that I was immune to the pull of expectation. It is one thing to declare independence in a moment of clarity, and another to live with the ripple effects when your neighbors and family interpret that choice as a slight. At night, I would lie awake and think of small domestic scenes, a child's bedtime story, the way the kettle whistles, a shawl draped over a chair, and try to hold them up like fragile things that needed protection. My instinct was not to punish. My instinct was to make sure that dignity had a place in whatever came next. And then came a phone call that shifted the air in the house. Emily's tone, usually brisk and rehearsed, carried an edge of accusation I had not heard before. "They're saying Lisa is trying to move in," she said.
For a moment, I felt the old stirrings of panic, the sense that a private matter was being transformed into a public drama. I wasn't sure where the rumor had started, but rumors, once loose, find their way into even the quietest corners. When Anna, my granddaughter, looked up from her crayon drawing and asked, "Is Grandma getting a lady to live with her?" I realized how rapidly small things can become big things in a neighborhood hungry for particulars. That evening, I sat with Lisa on the porch.
The sky was a deep bruise of navy, and the lamps from the houses 2 doors down glowed like safe beacons. Lisa refilled the bird feeder and handed me a mug. "People will talk," she said, simply. She said it like someone who has seen life in its raw edges and knows which words calm and which provoke. "We can choose what to respond to," she added. In her modest, exact way, she had become someone who steadied storms rather than stirring them. Her presence felt like a hinge on which my world might turn, for better or worse. As the cold crept into the corners of the house and the blue jay grew fatter on seed, I felt a pressure gathering that I could not ignore. Emily's skepticism, the neighborhood's whispers, the necessity of medical decisions, they layered upon one another like winter coats until movement felt heavy. I started to document things, phone calls, visits, small acts of care. Not to weaponize, but to record. There is power in witness, in the simple act of remembering who did what and when. Documentation, oddly, felt like an act of tenderness toward my future self. It was in that pressure, equal parts deterred by the possibility of estrangement and buoyed by a newly felt inner boundary, that a new resolve formed. I wanted to make choices that reflected who I had been in the world, someone who kept plates warm, washed dishes at midnight, stayed up for school projects. I wanted those small acts to be honored, but I also wanted to protect the grandchildren from being taught that love is transactional. That decision, half-formed and trembling, would be the hinge for what followed. I did not know, sitting on my porch with a mug warming my palms, that choosing dignity would invite a counterforce I had not fully anticipated. I could not see yet how the neat, sensible plans Emily believed in would collide with the ragged, patient loyalty of people who show up without expecting to be counted. I only knew, with a clarity that surprised me, that I could not go back to hiding in the background of my own life. The next steps would require courage I had not used in decades, and a willingness to be visible in a way that felt dangerous and true. When I hung up the phone with Mr. Halloway, and then called Emily to tell her I had an appointment, our conversation tightened into an awkward chord. "I'm not excluding you from anything," I said, the words tasting cautious and deliberate. "I just want to make sure that the people who have been with me are recognized." She was quiet for a long time, and then finally she said, "You always make these decisions without thinking of the consequences." Her voice cracked on the last word, and in it I heard something I hadn't been listening for. Fear. Fear that the family she'd cobbled together with her own weary hands might be redefined. We hung up with more unsaid than said. The night outside was full of the ordinary sounds of a neighborhood settling down. I stood at the window and watched the porch light of the house across the lane flicker on. For the first time in a long while, I felt both the solitude of my position and the swell of a new kind of company. People who had arrived not because they were obliged, but because they chose to be there. That company felt fragile. It also felt real. There was no dramatic cliff to end this chapter, only the slow accrual of choices that would soon demand a more formal shape. I had made a quiet list, I had called a lawyer, and I had told at least one child that my future would not be decided by default. The pieces were on the table, small and ordinary: a worn shawl, a crayon drawing, a thermos filled with tea, a notebook with faint ink. I folded the notebook closed and put it in the drawer where I kept other small, important things. Tomorrow, I would go to an appointment and talk about particulars with a professional who could help name things without telling me what to feel. For now, there was the porch, the low thrum of a life that had been lived in service, and the gentle, steady presence of someone who had come with warm socks and stayed with silence. The morning of my appointment arrived with the kind of brittle light that makes the lawn look like it's been dusted in sugar. I put on the shawl, the one with the faded navy pattern I'd worn since Emily was small,
because ritual comforts the same part of you that a proper breakfast cannot reach when the world feels slightly tilted. Mr. Holloway's office smelled of old books and lemon oil. He guided me in the way someone who has spent a life listening might guide a person across an unfamiliar room, steady, unhurried, as if everything worth saying could wait its turn. We spoke about particulars, but we spoke about other things too. What mattered to me, what felt like theft if misunderstood, the small acts that had accumulated into the scaffolding of my life. I told him about Anna's crayon drawings, about the way Lisa had learned my rhythms, about the thermos that had become an emblem of steady presence. He asked me gently who I wanted to remember in the ways that mattered. I named people, not as an instruction manual for the living, but as the story I wanted to tell about my life. He nodded and made patient notes. "What you're doing," he said at one point, "is not an assault on anyone. It's an articulation of values." He explained in calm language the difference between tangible bequests and small, named gestures, the letter tucked in a drawer, a friend entrusted with a book, a nurse recognized in a modest way. He did not moralize. He only helped me translate the contents of my notebook, its tenderness and its anger and its fairness, into language a court clerk might understand if she ever had to. I left the office with an envelope that felt in my hands like a small vessel.
I drove home slowly, the car heater doing its quiet domestic work, and I thought about how odd it felt to derive courage from paper. I thought about all the nights I had spent making do, patching lunches, pressing costumes, sewing patches on knees, and I understood that the act of naming was less about money and more about dignity. The choice I was making was not punitive. I told myself that often, as if repeating the phrase might be a kind of armor. I am not doing this to punish. I am doing it to be honest about who showed up.
Emily listened, and occasionally she nodded, but the nods had the shape of negotiation rather than the warmth of understanding. At the end of the meeting, she said, "I'll talk to Dad about this," and that statement landed like a stone with an edge I had not expected. Rumors, once loosed, have a peculiar way of amplifying whatever they touch. Someone in the neighborhood used to borrow tools from my shed. She came by one morning with a lemon bar and a sideways question. "Is everything okay with the house?" It was, she said, because when she heard lawyer and friend in the same sentence, it made people wonder. Insinuation passed through the neighborhood like a draft through a half-cracked window. It arrived in small, hollow sympathies. Well, it is hard to know who's influencing whom. Those words are designed to press a sore spot and then hide. Emily's next move surprised me with its coldness. She filed a petition with a local probate court, questioning my capacity and alleging undue influence. She did not in that first flurry accuse Lisa of anything criminal. She did not need to. The petition, crafted in legal cadence, suggested I had been coerced into decisions that altered my estate in favor of a non-relative. It was a precise phrase designed to make neighbors tilt their heads and say quietly, "Isn't that sad?" I will not pretend I was not wounded. There was a moment of stunned incredulity, as if a private grief had been translated into public suspicion. There are practical things probate does. It puts a pause on certain transactions. It asks for witnesses. It summons people to speak. I will not walk you through the legal minutiae because I am not a lawyer, and that would be foolish at this point. What I will say is that the petition required me to enter a public arena I had spent a lifetime avoiding. The small life I had curated, the shawl, the tea, the bird feeder, now had to be defended in a place where voices carry differently. The first hearing was quiet and tense. I sat with a cardigan over my knees, Anna's crayon sun tucked into my bag because some small talisman studies a heart that is being examined. Mr. Halloway came with a gentle authority and a stack of folded papers. Lisa came too, and sat with her hands folded like someone who had learned to carry calm in her palms. Emily sat opposite us, her face composed, her posture like a shield. Her voice, when the clerk called the case, was controlled. She said she was worried about me. She said she just wanted to ensure everything was done properly. Those words were not lies. They were the bones of truth wrapped in something harder, a fear that had found its teeth. Neighbors were present, small and curious. Someone had posted in the neighborhood group, and you could feel how the whispering world likes to witness scandal as if it were theater.
Anna came with me at first, then was whisked away by a kindly aunt who lived a few houses over, because an adult's court can be a heavy curtain for a child. In that room, with fluorescent lights and stiff chairs, everything seemed larger and more brittle than it had on the porch. The petition did not succeed in immediately overturning the will or removing my agency. It did, however, place strain on Lisa in ways that made her pause. Calls came to the agency. Whispers moved like ink and water. People who had once smiled politely at Lisa began to ask, in that tone reserved for moral inventory, whether she had overstepped. Lisa, who had never sought limelight, suddenly found herself the subject of community curiosity. She took those blows with a quiet dignity that made my throat ache. Her presence throughout never became loud or theatrical. She answered questions with clarity and with the simplicity of someone who had done no wrong. In the weeks that followed, my health, which had been wobbly before, took on the strain of being pulled in multiple directions. There were tests, as there always were, and there were nights when pain made me breathe in small, diligent increments. But there were also ordinary mornings, the kettle, the blue jay, the sun on the porch. It's strange how life crafts a braided pattern out of the dramatic and the mundane. The two do not cancel one another. They coexist in a way that can be both tender and cruel. The grandchildren became unwitting cartographers of the household's mood. Anna began to ask questions that landed on my kitchen table like small coins. "Grandma, why is everyone talking?" she asked one afternoon, as if searching for the shape of a concept she didn't have words for yet. I knelt so I was at her eye level and said simply, "Sometimes grown-ups worry about one another." She nodded, as children do, and then resumed her drawing. Children possess a merciful resilience. They will draw suns while adults are wringing their hands.
On a particularly cold afternoon, when a plate of lemon bars had been given to me and a neighbor's eyes had hosted suspicion like a guest, Lisa made the tea without comment and set the cup before me. "You keep the kettle on," she said, mildly. "We'll get through this, your way." Her words were not heroic. They were reasonable, precise, and full of an everyday courage I had not been trained to expect from strangers. At one point, guilt, that stubborn, uninvited companion, came knocking. Friends urged me to reconsider, to smooth things over with Emily before the petition could gain any traction. "Can't you make her feel included?" one asked, as if the soothing of a child could be achieved by adding a seat at the table. I tried. I invited Emily to tea. I wrote letters explaining my motives, that this was not exclusionary, that my dignity mattered as much as practicality. I left voicemails that were full of gentle reasons. Some of those attempts landed, others ricocheted. And then a quiet thing happened that shifted the axis again. Emily, in the course of searching through old boxes for one of her father's things, a thing she said she needed for memories, found a letter I had never expected would matter to the case. It was a letter from her father, written in small, shaky handwriting years ago, one of those late attempts at contrition that men who are uneven at apology sometimes produce. In the letter were words that spoke of regret, of an inability to be the husband he wanted to be, of admiring me for holding the family together when he could not. He wrote, in a way that was sudden and honest, that he had been selfish, and that he hoped Emily could forgive him someday. Emily read it with a look that was difficult to parse. It was as if the letter had created space inside her to feel alongside her armor. She came to the house that afternoon, the envelope in her hands, and sat across from me on the porch in a way that resembled someone unclenching. "I found this," she said, and there was a vulnerability under her usual steel. She admitted, quietly, that she had been angry at the world and at me, for reasons that were partly her own and partly deeper and older. She apologized, not theatrically, not in the way a playwright might demand, but in flinty, human fragments. "I'm sorry I made you feel like you were in the way," she said. "I was scared. I thought if we didn't control things, everything I'd worked to protect would fall apart." I listened. The urge to be angry and to roll my sleeves up in defense was present. Old hurts elbowed for space. But there was also an aching recognition that pain begets protection, and protection, when it becomes a habit, often takes the shape of control. Emily's apology was not a full undoing. It did not erase the legal petition or the whispered conversations. It was, however, an offering, a small, human-shaped thing. I accepted it in the sense that one accepts a bandage. It does not cure a wound, but it covers it for a time and allows healing to begin. We did not resolve everything that day. There were still letters to be exchanged, still a hearing set down the line where the court would weigh arguments and gestures. But there was a new layer of tenderness in our conversations. She still had questions, and I still had decisions. But we had, for the first time in a long while, an admission of shared failure and of the mutual needs that had driven us apart. In the hearings that followed, Emily's petition lost some of its momentum as likelihoods of undue influence were examined, and as my documents were found to be consistent and clear. Mr. Halloway argued not out of victory, but out of calm. He presented my lists, my notes, the witnesses who could attest to Lisa's presence and integrity. Neighbors who had once whispered kindly found voices to speak plainly. They had seen a woman, not a scheme. The community's narrative softened when it recognized that what it had once viewed as potential impropriety was in fact a simple human reciprocity. Although the petition did not completely dissolve, the conflict transformed from legal spectacle into a familial negotiation. Emily and I began, reluctantly and carefully, to begin a reparative conversation about what responsibility actually meant. She acknowledged, in small ways, that the ledger she kept did not always include the cost she had paid. I acknowledged equally that my choices had ripple effects she had to live with. We set informal boundaries. She would be consulted in major decisions, and I would in turn be honest about my wishes. It was imperfect. Reconciliation rarely arrives in clean lines. It often comes like a tide, creeping forward and receding, leaving shells of progress in its wake. During this time, my health continued to be a variable. The treatments were unglamorous, the days sometimes full of quiet fatigue that made reading a sentence feel like climbing a hill. But there were good days, bright mornings when Anna ran in with a new drawing and declared with solemnity that the sun in her picture was extra shiny today. Those days reminded me why I had begun this path in the first place, to protect the small, curative things that matter more than bank balances. Lisa's role in those days was small and vast at once. She did not parade her loyalty like a banner. Instead, she arrived with tea, with sleeves rolled up, with a capacity for silence that feels, for some people, like a blessing. She sometimes took Anna to the feeder and explained how to refill it and why blue jays like certain seeds. She read to me when my eyes were tired. She transcribed the letter my father had once written in case it was needed for clarity. She never asked us to prove who we were. She simply held the fact of us gently.
When the neighborhood chatter finally quieted, it did so not because a scandal had been exposed as false, but because people migrated to other narratives. Life, mercifully, moves on. The grandchildren resumed their small, brilliant occupations, building forts in living rooms, arguing about who gets which piece of the puzzle, dropping drawings on my table that are archival treasures in themselves. There was a small dinner we had one evening, nothing grand, just a roast, scones, and a table set with mismatched plates. Emily came early and helped me set the table. There were tentative jokes, a tussle over the salt, a moment where Anna insisted I taste the pudding first. We did not pretend the past had never happened. We acknowledged it in small ways, a pause before an old joke, a quiet look. Such gestures to me felt like stitches. After the legal cloud lifted into a less dominant shape, I found myself writing letters again, not for court, but for the simple pleasure of making sentences for people I loved. I wrote to old friends, to neighbors who had been steady, to Anna with notes tucked into her lunchbox. I wrote one letter to Lisa because it felt right to say, in words, what her presence had done. It had made my life less lonely. It had returned to me the dignity of someone seen for who she was, not for how useful she might be. There is a clarity that arrives in the wake of confrontation, a particular sort of lucidity that feels like clean dishes left to dry. I began in ordinary ways to redefine what legacy meant. Legacy, I realized, is not a ledger anyone else gets to write. It is an accumulation of small insistences, that children be taught to show up, that neighbors be given the benefit of the doubt, that the people who make your life better be remembered not as conveniences but as companions. Emily and I reached a fragile truce. She apologized more fully after the letter. I forgave in the way that people with long histories do, not by erasing, but by accepting the scarred map that relationships become. We had conversations where we spoke about what had been missing in her childhood, where she could recount the tiredness she felt from years of carrying, and where I could tell her what it cost me to move from a marriage that had been unkind. Those exchanges were not blame games. They were awkwardly and bravely attempts at mutual recognition. In the months after, the house settled into a new rhythm. The blue jay returned, brazen and certain. Anna's drawings multiplied and found a place on the refrigerator, each son slightly different from the one before. Lisa's visits continued, as did her small efficiencies, the repairing of a loose button on my cardigan, the recommendation of a warm woolen blanket that was, I decided, worth the modest price. She said one afternoon, "You taught me how to be a better listener," which sounded to me like the most unusual compliment, as if someone had given me back a skill I had mislaid.
The final resolution was not dramatic. There were no final scenes of cathartic courtroom flourishes. What happened, instead, was a series of small reconciliations and a more persistent understanding of our separate selves. I signed the revised documents, not as an act of defiance, but as an act of self-definition. I left modest bequests to the grandchildren, to a small fund for their creative endeavors, and a token for Lisa to recognize her steadiness. I wrote letters to each person named in my notebook, explaining why they mattered. That gesture felt less like dispatching property and more like placing luminaries along the path I had walked and the path I hoped others would follow. There were still neighborhood voices that whispered from time to time, curiosity reviving like a wind that stirs the hair, but mostly the chatter had moved on. People resumed their own lives. Emily and I developed a better rhythm. She called less like a distraught manager and more like a daughter checking in. She still had sharp edges and impulses toward control, but hers had softened with some new honesty. We never returned to the exact, uncomplicated ease we once had, that childlike unthinking of affection, because time and hurt leave marks, but there was warmth, and that warmth for me was enough. On a soft spring afternoon, a few seasons after the hearing, we had a small gathering in the backyard. The grandchildren ran between sun and shade, their laughter like small chimes. Anna brought a drawing of the whole family, stick figures, a big blue jay, a smiling sun. My heart was full in the way an old house is full of the smells of baking bread, abundant, ordinary, sustaining. Emily sat on the low wall and passed me a plate of scones, and we ate in a companionable silence. There was no grand, sweeping forgiveness scene, rather a string of ordinary kindnesses that felt like a new architecture for a relationship reborn in a quieter way. I found in that time a tenderness for myself I had not allowed before. It arrived as small things, letting the dishes sit unwashed when my energy was low, lighting a candle for no reason other than that I wanted the room to glow, saying no to invitations that felt like undertows rather than comfort. Choosing myself felt at first selfish, and then it felt like the only honest way to be. To choose those who had been with me, friends, grandchildren, a nurse named Lisa, was not vindictive. It was an assertion that the measure of a life is not only its income but its relationships, and that dignity deserved attention as much as any ledger. The legacy I had feared losing was not money or property alone. It was the memory of my presence in the lives I had touched. I wanted my grandchildren to learn that love is a verb. It shows up, it brings soup, it refills a bird feeder, it lies awake when the house is quiet. I wanted Emily to remember that the past is complicated, and that both of us had been, at times, both broken and brave.
Sometimes, late at night, I would take out the small lined notebook and read through the lists I had made. Names, small recollections, incidents that had mattered. Some entries made me smile, others made me ache. I would tuck the notebook away and stand at the window to watch the porch light across the lane. Once, when a gust pushed a leaf along the sidewalk in a little anxious dance, I realized how much weight I had carried for other people over the years, not out of obligation alone, but because it had been my way of loving. I did not regret that burden entirely. It had shaped me into someone generous and patient. But I also recognized that generosity should not mean being invisible. In my 50s, when illness forced me to look both inward and outward, I learned a crucial thing, that self-respect can be an act of love toward others as much as toward oneself. By naming who mattered, and by refusing to be erased, I was not rejecting my daughters so much as affirming the people who had shown up in ways that words could scarcely hold. Love, ultimately, is about presence, the messy, imperfect kind that will bring you a thermos and watch the blue jay without asking for repayment. If you've walked a similar road, if you have felt the quiet ache of being taken for granted, or the sharp sting of setting a boundary against someone you love, I hope my story offers a single modest consolation. You can choose dignity without hating yourself, and you can forgive without erasing the past. There is courage in naming what you want to remember. There is grace in choosing who will carry your stories. If this resonates with you, share a moment in the comments. Your voice could help someone else choose themselves.